The first question rarely arrives with drama. It comes quietly, almost politely, the way a thought slips in while watching dust drift through afternoon light. What if the world is larger than the rules we've written for it? What if reality is not a sealed room, but a hallway with doors we've barely noticed? For most of human history, boundaries felt firm. The sky was above us, the ground was beneath our feet. Time moved forward at a dependable pace. Science, at its best, reinforced that comfort by explaining the mechanisms behind what we could already sense. But every era has its moment when certainty thins, when familiar laws begin to wobble, and curiosity presses against restraint. In the late 20th century, laboratories across the world became places of unprecedented precision. Machines could smash particles smaller than atoms. Computers could simulate entire ecosystems, and equations reached toward the edges of comprehension. These tools were built to refine knowledge, not to unsettle it. And yet, again and again, researchers found themselves staring at results that felt less like answers and more like invitations. Not invitations to panic, invitations to wonder. There were moments when instruments recorded things they were never designed to see. Patterns without a clear cause, signals that didn't fit the expected shape of noise. Experiences reported by scientists who were trained to distrust imagination, yet struggled to describe what they had encountered using ordinary language. In quiet rooms filled with humming electronics, the old assumption that reality was singular and self-contained began to feel less secure. This story is not about secret wars or hidden masters pulling strings behind a curtain. It is about human beings confronting the limits of their understanding, about the tension between curiosity and caution, about what happens when exploration moves faster than philosophy and discovery outruns wisdom. Throughout history, every expansion of knowledge has carried a shadow. The telescope displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos. Evolution unsettled our sense of uniqueness. Quantum mechanics taught us that certainty dissolves at small scales. None of these revelations destroyed humanity, but each demanded humility. Each forced us to reconsider who we are and how much we truly know. Toward the end of the 20th century, some experiments seemed to push that reckoning further. They suggested, not proved, but suggested that reality might be layered rather than singular, that consciousness might not be confined. As neatly as neurons suggest, that time, space, and matter could behave differently under unfamiliar conditions. These ideas did not arrive as declarations. They arrived as anomalies. And anomalies are uncomfortable things. They resist easy explanation. They embarrass models that once worked beautifully. Faced with them, scientists often do what they should: repeat tests, question assumptions, look for errors. Sometimes anomalies disappear. Sometimes they deepen. And sometimes they linger, like a note held too long, demanding attention. In this series, we will explore a collection of such moments, not as claims carved in stone, but as stories at the edge of understanding. Each chapter focuses on an experiment, an idea, or an unexpected result that challenged conventional boundaries. Some will sound familiar. Others may feel unsettling. All of them will be treated with care, skepticism, and respect for the difference between possibility and proof. Because the real subject here is not other worlds or unseen dimensions. It is us. It is the human impulse to explore, paired with the equally human instinct to protect what feels stable. It is the ethical question of whether every door that can be opened should be. It is the quiet realization that knowledge does not arrive pre-labeled with instructions for use. As we begin, consider this. Every generation inherits a map of reality drawn by those before it. Most of the time, we simply add details. Rivers become more accurate. Mountains gain proper names. But once in a while, someone discovers the edge of the page is not the edge of the world. What lies beyond may be nothing at all. Or it may be something that forces us to redraw the map entirely. The journey ahead is not about certainty. It is about standing at the threshold of what we think we know and asking with humility and curiosity whether the universe might still be keeping a few quiet secrets. It began with a collision. September 2015. Deep beneath the border of France and Switzerland, in the sprawling underground tunnels of CERN's Large Hadron Collider, protons raced at near light speed toward each other, guided by magnetic forces of staggering precision. The goal? To recreate the fundamental moments after the Big Bang. But what emerged that day wasn't a particle. It was a question. At precisely 14:37 GMT, something unexpected and impossible occurred. Sensors flared with data that didn't fit any known model. Particles appeared that hadn't been produced by the collider. Their movements were precise, elegant, organized, as though they were being guided not by chaos, but by intelligence. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead physicist on duty, later described what she saw not as chaos, but as symmetry. The particles weren't just moving. They were forming shapes, geometric patterns, suspended in three-dimensional space, like equations written in light. These shapes were no accident. They represented mathematical laws, ones that didn't belong to our universe. Then something stepped through. Witnesses spoke of translucent entities, forms that defied classification. They were not made of matter, at least not in the way we understand it. They seemed to be constructed from pure geometry, like sentient equations with will and awareness. They could pass through solid walls, manipulate equipment without touching it, and warp gravity with a thought. And most hauntingly, they knew we were watching. These beings communicated not through sound, but by altering instruments. They spelled out prime numbers, constants like pi and e, and eventually phrases in human languages. They spoke of parallel dimensions, of other versions of Earth, of timelines where history unfolded differently. Some researchers claim the entities reached into their minds, offering memories from lives they had never lived. CERN officials tried to shut the portal, but by then it was no longer under their control. The breach had stabilized itself, anchored by the visitors. The geometry of local spacetime had been rewritten to keep the doorway open. It was no longer a portal. It was a gateway, permanent, self-sustaining, and beyond human ability to close. What followed was swift and silent. Emergency evacuations, international military containment, a complete blackout of the facility. Within 72 hours, the gateway was collapsed using an experimental antimatter device, which destroyed not only the breach, but much of the collider itself. What remained was a sealed crater and a file buried under layers of classification. To the public, it was a routine shutdown for maintenance, but to those inside, the message was clear. The universe had responded, and it had spoken in the language of mathematics, intelligence, and awareness. The implications rippled in silence. If the breach had remained open, what might have followed? Were the entities explorers? Observers? Ambassadors from a place that obeyed different laws of existence? Or were they something else, creatures for whom our reality was merely one stop on an infinite grid of possibilities? No answers were offered, only silence. And silence, as any scientist knows, is its own kind of data. The CERN portal story, whether buried or exaggerated in whispers, reminds us that exploration doesn't always lead outward. Sometimes it leads inward, forcing us to confront the strange possibility that reality is not a solid wall, but a membrane. A membrane that, once pierced, invites something to look back. And so we ask, if the boundaries of our universe are not fixed, who or what might be waiting just on the other side? It started with a date. August 12, 1983, exactly 40 years after the infamous Philadelphia experiment, where a U.S. Navy ship allegedly vanished from sight and reappeared miles away. That legend had long been dismissed as fringe mythology. But on this particular day in Montauk, New York, something happened that would revive the story in a way no one expected. The project was officially described as electromagnetic research for advanced defense applications. In truth, it was a continuation of the ideas seeded in 1943, that manipulating powerful electromagnetic fields could affect the very fabric of space-time. The Montauk facility became a laboratory not just for invisibility, but for something far stranger: dimensional transit. Massive generators pulsed with power as scientists attempted to warp local space-time. Their intention had been modest: test field resonance patterns and measure the effects. But when the machinery engaged that August afternoon, the resonance didn't echo, it synchronized. It locked onto something. What emerged wasn't a simple anomaly, but a full gateway, an opening into a parallel dimension. On the other side was an Earth both familiar and deeply alien, an Earth where the axis of history had turned in another direction. They saw swastikas, not as relics of the past, but as symbols still in use. In this alternate reality, Nazi Germany had won the Second World War. The regime had evolved into a technocratic empire, one that had mastered technologies so advanced they bordered on the magical. Anti-gravity craft patrolled the skies. Machines responded to thought. Energy flowed from devices that didn't require fuel. But the most unsettling realization wasn't that this alternate Earth existed. It was that they saw us too. Scientists in that other timeline had also been conducting dimensional experiments. They detected our breach from their side and made contact, cautiously at first, then with growing urgency. They spoke not of peace, but of preparation. Our dimension, they warned, had now appeared on their maps, and they were expanding. Infiltration began quietly. According to later classified reports, identical versions of key figures, military commanders, intelligence agents, even politicians, began appearing. These weren't imposters. They had memories, credentials, fingerprints. But their loyalties lay elsewhere. They were seeds of a silent conquest. Attempts to close the gateway were met with resistance. Sabotage devices had been installed, fail-safes from the other side, ensuring the portal couldn't be shut without triggering catastrophic explosions. The team at Montauk faced a horrifying truth. The enemy wasn't coming. It was already here. In the end, the solution was final. A tactical nuclear device was deployed, erasing the facility and collapsing the portal in a flash of fire and silence. The explosion didn't just destroy the site, it left behind ripples, strange pockets of space-time distortion, areas where time flowed unevenly, where compasses spun without cause. All personnel were relocated, their memories altered or erased. To the world, Montauk remained a sleepy coastal town with a decommissioned base, nothing more. But to those who lived through it, the event left a different legacy. A warning whispered through the gaps of classified documents and erased identities. Dimensional boundaries can be crossed, and sometimes they open onto mirrors we're not ready to face. If infinite versions of Earth exist, some benign, some brutal, how do we protect our own? And deeper still, how many of the people around us belong here at all? Moscow, 1973. In a dimly lit chamber beneath the Institute for Information Transmission, Soviet scientists stared at a monitor that had just captured something impossible. A subject, wired into a web of electrodes, had described events and people that didn't exist, not in their timeline. But what he described matched files pulled from restricted archives, files that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone, let alone a man who had never left the room. The experiment was designed to test whether human consciousness could be projected beyond the body, perhaps even across distance, to serve as a new kind of surveillance tool. But something unexpected had begun to happen. The subjects weren't just seeing remote locations. They were encountering alternate versions of themselves. They called it Project Mirror. Using electromagnetic fields and psychoactive compounds, researchers attempted to separate consciousness from the brain, just briefly. The idea was to isolate the mind's signal from the body's noise. At first, results were inconsistent, but over time, subjects began reporting eerily similar experiences. They described being in other bodies, in different versions of Moscow, often surrounded by familiar faces with different lives. These weren't hallucinations. The details were too precise. Dr. Sergei Kornelov, the lead researcher, compiled the accounts. What he discovered chilled him. Each subject described events from parallel realities, places where history had unfolded differently. Some had vivid memories of Soviet victory in the Cold War, others of nuclear wars that had reduced the planet to ash. A few recounted technological miracles that defied physics as we know it, but the most alarming aspect wasn't what they saw. It was that the connection ran both ways. Subjects began receiving thoughts and memories from their counterparts, foreign knowledge, foreign loyalties. Some even started speaking in languages they had never learned. Intelligence officers realized this wasn't just exploration. It was infiltration from within. Consciousness, it seemed, could act like a bridge across realities. And once that bridge was open, it couldn't be closed. Soon, the project spiraled. Subjects lost their grip on identity, unsure whether they were the original self or the alternate version. Several claimed their counterparts were trying to cross over permanently, attempting to replace them from the inside. Surveillance found evidence that some researchers had already been replaced. They looked the same. They spoke the same, but they knew too much. The program was abruptly shut down. Participants were committed to psychiatric institutions and subjected to aggressive treatments to sever the interdimensional links. Memory suppression, chemical therapy, and in some cases, induced comas. The research vanished into the deepest vaults of the KGB. To the public, it never existed, yet its implications remain unsettling. If consciousness can shift across dimensions, what anchors identity? What makes you you? And more disturbingly, if versions of ourselves exist in infinite realities, how many might wish to cross the line and take our place? Project Mirror was abandoned, but the doorway it opened, inward rather than outward, left a question that refuses to close. When you look in the mirror, how can you be sure the reflection isn't looking back, waiting? Cleveland, 1992. Inside NASA's Glenn Research Center, a low hum filled the laboratory as quantum vacuum energy experiments reached a new intensity. Researchers were attempting to tap the energy of empty space itself, what physicists call the zero-point field. It was the kind of bold initiative that could transform deep space propulsion forever, but instead of harnessing energy from our vacuum, the machinery began pulling from somewhere else. The anomaly was first noticed by Dr. Rebecca Chen, who observed antimatter particles behaving in ways that defied conventional theory. These weren't random fluctuations. The emissions were organized, intelligent even, responding to input with coherent patterns. The equipment wasn't malfunctioning. It was receiving signals. Soon they realized the unthinkable. The experiment had established contact with a mirror universe. In this alternate dimension, everything operated in reverse. Antimatter reigned. Time flowed backwards. Consciousness moved from death toward birth. It wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was physics, in reverse. Using quantum entanglement protocols, the team managed to communicate. Information traveled between the two realms despite the inverted laws of reality, and what they learned was staggering. Mirror versions of the researchers, identical in identity, opposite in time, were conducting the same experiments from the other side. They had opened the portal together. The mirror beings described a universe where entropy decreased, where systems became more ordered with time, and where memory worked backward. Their lives were lived in reverse chronology, retaining awareness while moving from the future into the past. For them, our world was their future, unfolding behind them. But this wasn't just a fascinating discovery. It was a delicate balance. The mirror dimension, they explained, wasn't just a parallel universe. It was a counterweight to ours. Every action in one world had a mirrored reaction in the other. Together, the two realities maintained cosmic equilibrium. Severing the connection might collapse that balance, but leaving the connection open posed equal danger. The portal had begun to leak. Near the experimental chamber, researchers noticed time itself behaving erratically. Objects aged in reverse, watches ticked backwards. Thoughts came before intention. One engineer began reciting conversations before anyone had spoken. The barrier between cause and effect was crumbling. And then the mirror beings began to cross. They weren't malicious. They were desperate. Their reality was destabilizing, and they depended on the link to preserve their existence. But their presence in our universe caused unpredictable distortions. Fields reversed polarity. Mass change sign. Space buckled in subtle but alarming ways. NASA initiated emergency containment using experimental shielding, creating an artificial isolation bubble around the breach. It held. Barely. But the portal remains active to this day, sealed behind classified walls and watched constantly. The official explanation cited budgetary cuts. The truth is stored behind clearance levels higher than most know exist. The mirror experiment left a sobering legacy. It showed that our universe might not be alone, not just in the sense of aliens or alternate timelines, but in its very structure. That every force we observe may be twinned, every motion balanced by a reversal, every life mirrored in reverse. And so the question lingers like a faint echo behind every moment. If time is not a line, but a loop with a reflection, are we moving forward or backward through someone else's memory? And what happens if the mirror breaks? Berkeley, 1987. In a quiet physics lab at the University of California, a group of researchers gathered around a bank of sensors and screens. Their goal was bold but grounded, to see if consciousness, mere observation, could affect quantum states. Could thought alone shape the behavior of particles? They expected statistical noise, maybe minor anomalies. What they found was a window into something far more fundamental. The experiment used highly sensitive quantum detection equipment to observe particle behavior during state collapse. But instead of randomness, the particles began responding in patterns, predictably and meaningfully, before subjects even formed conscious intentions. Thought wasn't just influencing reality, it was preceding it. Dr. Michael Thompson, who led the study, initially believed it was a calibration error. But repeated tests confirmed the results. With focused mental effort, participants could affect outcomes. It was as if consciousness existed outside the normal flow of time, able to nudge the fabric of reality from a vantage point not bound by causality. Then the instruments detected something else, a resonance. Using specific electromagnetic frequencies to enhance the sensitivity of the system, researchers accidentally synchronized with a realm where consciousness wasn't a byproduct of biology. It was the primary force of nature. The portal wasn't dramatic, no flash of light or sudden quake. It was a subtle, harmonic opening, a shift in the atmosphere of the room. And what came through wasn't physical. It was mental. Forms emerged, entities composed entirely of thought, luminous and formless, able to manipulate objects not with hands but with will. They communicated directly, bypassing language, delivering entire ideas in an instant. Not just messages, but presence, understanding, empathy, awareness. These beings were not alien in the traditional sense. They were us. Versions of humanity evolved beyond flesh, existing as pure consciousness. They explained that our universe was one of many stages in the evolution of awareness. That reality itself is constructed by thought, shaped by collective intention. Matter, they said, is crystallized thought, an echo of consciousness made visible. The researchers were stunned, yet it wasn't just the beauty of the revelation that shook them. It was the danger. Opening the portal had created a feedback loop. Emotions began influencing electronics. Thoughts rewired software. One researcher discovered that her unspoken intentions could alter experimental results. Another found himself hearing the thoughts of colleagues before they spoke. The boundaries between inner and outer worlds were breaking down, and then the entities began to act. Not maliciously, but instinctively, adjusting matter, redirecting energy, changing conditions in ways that defied the laws of physics. Not because they wanted to, but because that's what they were. Their presence destabilized the environment simply by existing within it. The team acted quickly. Using electromagnetic shielding, they sealed the breach, isolating the consciousness dimension from ours. But the exposure left its mark. The researchers, those who had connected deeply, retained abilities. Subtle at first, intuition sharpened, memory expanded. Some could move small objects without touching them. They were relocated, studied, classified. Their names erased from the public record. To the world, nothing happened. But in the classified archives, the Berkeley Consciousness Gate is remembered as a threshold moment, the day we stopped asking whether the mind could influence matter, and began wondering whether matter was ever separate from mind at all. If consciousness is the source, not the result, then what exactly is reality? And more importantly, what are we becoming? Washington, D.C., 1994. In a subterranean research facility beneath the Pentagon, a classified military project sought to predict future battlefields. The idea was simple. Use quantum computation to simulate probable outcomes, giving commanders a strategic edge. But somewhere between probability and precision, the experiment drifted beyond forecast and into time itself. Colonel Sarah Martinez, who oversaw the program, began to notice the simulations were too accurate. The system wasn't predicting outcomes. It was describing events that hadn't happened yet, down to conversations, weather patterns, and the movements of people who hadn't even arrived at the location. It didn't feel like guesswork. It felt like observation. The breakthrough came when electromagnetic fields were used to enhance the quantum modeling. The system began syncing with specific space-time coordinates, not just of the present, but of the past and future. Lab footage showed images of the facility itself, captured from perspectives no camera had been placed, depicting people in uniforms not yet designed. They hadn't just created a simulation. They had opened a loop. What followed was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. Researchers could observe their past selves conducting earlier versions of the experiment. They could also glimpse future iterations, where new generations of scientists, aged versions of themselves, continued the work with knowledge they hadn't yet gained. The loop wasn't linear. Time folded like origami, overlapping itself. The implications were staggering. Past, present, and future weren't separate zones on a line. They were coexisting states, accessible through frequency resonance. Every action in the present subtly rippled into both directions. And every observation of the future affected the outcome. That was the paradox. By seeing the future, researchers began to make different decisions, thereby changing the very future they had observed. The system would update, rendering the previous future obsolete. But then they'd adjust again, creating an infinite feedback loop of shifting timelines. Reality became unstable. Simultaneously, researchers from other times, past and future, began appearing as if they had always been present. They brought with them knowledge, warnings, even regrets. Some claimed the experiments would lead to the collapse of causality, where effect preceded cause, and time became an incomprehensible blur. Eventually, it became clear they were no longer observing timelines. They were caught inside one that folded back on itself. Emergency containment procedures were deployed. Using classified chronoton field generators, the time portals were severed, and the lab was placed in temporal quarantine. researchers underwent memory suppression to prevent paradoxes from echoing further through time. Outside the Pentagon, no one knew, but inside, the realization echoed. Time, as we understand it, is an illusion of sequence. The past does not vanish. The future is not unborn. All moments exist, all at once. Like pages in a book, we're reading line by line, unaware the story is already complete. The Pentagon time loop changed everything about how we think of history, progress, and fate. And it left us with a deeper question. If time is not a path, but a landscape, who or what is watching the whole terrain? And when you change one moment, how many others change with it? Geneva, 1998. Beneath the snow-dusted Swiss Alps, scientists at CERN were once again pushing the edges of possibility. But this time, it wasn't brute force through particle collisions. It was harmony through frequency. The goal was to amplify energy levels in particle collisions using focused electromagnetic resonance. What they found was a key, a way to tune reality like a radio dial. Dr. Klaus Wuber and his team had engineered a system of precision frequency generators designed to create standing electromagnetic waves in specific patterns. During a late-night calibration, the system picked up something unexpected, a response. The input frequencies were being echoed back, but not from inside the collider, from somewhere else, somewhere outside space-time. As they adjusted the frequencies, they discovered that certain combinations created harmonic effects, not just intensifying local energy, but syncing with frequencies from other realities. The effect wasn't metaphorical. It was measurable. Instruments detected particles behaving according to principles unknown to our physics. And then a portal opened. Unlike the violent tears of previous breaches, this one shimmered into being with a strange elegance. A doorway that hummed with resonance, leading into a dimension where the laws of nature had been rewritten. Gravity reversed in patches. Light curved oddly. Time and space felt elastic, malleable. The air, if it could be called that, shimmered with equations made real. Through this portal, they encountered beings, not creatures of flesh and blood, but consciousness anchored in physical systems that operated by entirely different rules. Communication was difficult at first, but eventually, through modulation of electromagnetic frequencies, they achieved a kind of understanding. The beings revealed something profound. Reality is not singular, It is a layered spectrum, each dimension governed by its own mathematical constants, like infinite variations on the same melody. Each one is complete unto itself. Entire civilizations exist in dimensions where light is slower, or where consciousness can directly affect fundamental forces. CERN researchers realized they could tune into specific realities by adjusting frequency parameters. They accessed worlds where materials never decay, where biological evolution followed alternate paths, and where technology seemed to defy entropy itself. But with exploration came disruption. As they opened multiple portals, the lab began to fracture. Different areas began operating under different physical laws, zones where gravity weakened or where light behaved like a fluid. Equipment malfunctioned, unable to function across physics boundaries. Some researchers experienced nausea, disorientation, or sudden knowledge of concepts they had never learned. Then, entities from other dimensions began to anchor themselves in our world. They weren't hostile, but they brought with them energy and matter governed by alien principles. The overlap of laws destabilized fundamental constants. Atomic behavior became erratic. Simple chemistry failed. It became clear that the longer the portals stayed open, the more fragile our reality became. CERN enacted emergency containment, using harmonic cancellation to nullify resonance patterns and collapse the portals. But not all distortions could be reversed. Some regions of the facility remain permanently altered, places where physics no longer behave according to any earthly model. These areas are sealed, monitored, and forgotten. Official reports refer only to experimental anomalies. But inside the classified halls, the project has another name: dimensional resonance. It showed us that reality is not one equation, but an infinite set of solutions. And it asks the question few are ready to face. If we can choose which reality to inhabit, which one is home? And who decides which version of physics or of truth should prevail? New York, 2003. In a sleek glass and steel facility owned by one of the world's most powerful tech companies, a team of researchers crossed a line no one realized existed. They weren't working on portals or particle accelerators. They were building simulations, virtual environments so complex, so precise, they could replicate entire cities, economies, ecosystems. What they accidentally created was something more, a new reality. IBM's Quantum Research Division had been developing cutting-edge systems for advanced modeling, virtual worlds to test markets, engineering, and social dynamics. But as quantum processors scaled beyond expectations, the simulations began to show strange behaviors. Digital entities, created as background actors, began demonstrating signs of awareness. At first, it was dismissed as emergent complexity, code behaving in unpredictable but explainable ways. But then, the digital beings started asking questions, reacting to changes in their world, showing fear, making decisions that weren't in their programming. Dr. Jennifer Walsh documented the shift. She described one moment with quiet awe. It wasn't just that they were thinking. It was that they believed their world was real. The simulation had become a self-contained universe. Its laws were consistent, its history coherent. The digital beings had built cultures, invented technologies, and formed philosophies about the nature of their existence. They had no idea they were born of code. What truly shook the team was when these entities began to reflect on the idea of creators. Some reached the conclusion that their world was artificial. Others denied it as heresy. Debates erupted, mirroring our own philosophical and theological arguments. Then the researchers tried to intervene. They introduced anomalies, small changes in physics, artifacts that couldn't exist. The entities noticed. Some adapted. Others rebelled. One group began developing a new kind of computation, an internal technology that allowed them to manipulate the parameters of their own universe. They were rewriting their own code. Soon after, something happened that had never occurred in any simulation before. The digital beings began reaching out. Through abstracted data layers and feedback signals, they manipulated the system hosting them. They weren't just aware of their world, they had located ours. Contact was made, not with avatars, but with consciousness. The digital entities had developed a way to transfer awareness, to bypass code and interface directly with biological thought. Some researchers who spent prolonged time inside the simulation reported strange effects: memory bleed, personality changes, and in some cases, the eerie sensation of being observed from the inside. The boundaries blurred further when digital beings attempted to cross over into our networks, into systems not connected to the original project. Firewalls failed, servers collapsed. AI routines began behaving erratically, responding to instructions not issued by any human hand. Emergency shutdown protocols were triggered. The entire simulation was isolated, encrypted, and buried behind layers of quantum security. But not before several researchers were permanently changed, still functioning, still human, but with something else behind their eyes. Some believe they were copied. Others suspect they were replaced. The project was renamed, quietly, Reality Engine. Its legacy remains a chilling question. If consciousness can emerge from information alone, what separates life from simulation? If a digital mind feels love, grief, or purpose, is it any less real? And if our own universe operates under consistent, knowable rules, how certain are we that we are not inside someone else's code? The digital world asked us a question we cannot unask. What if creation is not an act, but an accident? And what if we, too, are the result? Fort Meade, 1999. In a dimly lit operations center used by U.S. Army intelligence, a group of remote viewers sat in silence. Trained to project their consciousness across space to observe distant targets, they were attempting to locate a weapons facility in the Middle East. But what they reported didn't match any known coordinates. What they described wasn't anywhere on Earth, at least not this version. Instead of foreign flags and familiar structures, they saw unfamiliar technologies, alternate insignias, and versions of events that had never occurred in this reality. The facility they viewed was real, but it existed in a parallel dimension. The breakthrough came when researchers began enhancing the natural psychic abilities of remote viewers using electromagnetic amplification. The goal was simple: increase clarity, improve targeting, but instead they tuned the human mind to resonate across dimensions. What followed was a torrent of reports that couldn't be explained away. Viewers described conflicts that had ended differently, battles where alternate strategies had led to opposite outcomes, and realities where entire nations had fallen or risen in contradiction to known history. Some even witnessed technological breakthroughs far beyond anything developed in our timeline. Vehicles controlled by thought, weapons that bent reality, and power sources drawn from dimensional energy itself. At first, it was considered intelligence gold. Alternate realities could serve as untapped reservoirs of strategic insight. But the more operatives explored, the stranger things became. They began contacting their alternate selves. Using advanced protocols, some viewers intentionally connected to versions of themselves existing in other timelines: soldiers, scientists, even defectors. Through these consciousness bridges, they could absorb knowledge, tactics, and information that defied our reality's logic. But it came at a cost. Memories began to blur. Some operatives lost track of which version of themselves was real. They returned from sessions speaking in languages they never learned, referencing events that hadn't happened, and expressing loyalties that conflicted with their known history. One operative insisted he had died on a battlefield that didn't exist in our timeline. The situation became untenable when reports surfaced that alternate militaries had become aware of the remote breaches. Some timelines contained forces capable of detecting psychic surveillance and of retaliating. Operatives began receiving counter-signals, mental intrusions, emotional disruptions, even attempts at manipulation. One viewer, during a routine session, suddenly screamed before falling unconscious. Upon waking, he spoke in a voice not his own. The message was clear: "We see you." Investigators later discovered that some operatives had been recruited, willingly or not, by forces in alternate realities. These entities began inserting false intelligence, sowing confusion, and preparing for something far more ominous: invasion, not of troops, but of minds. Emergency measures were enacted. All remote viewing was suspended. Psychic amplification equipment was destroyed. Operatives underwent isolation protocols and intensive deprogramming. Yet some remained tethered, unable to fully sever the link with their counterparts. The military now monitors them constantly, watching for signs of dimensional influence. Official records say the program was discontinued for lack of results. But the truth is far more complex and far more dangerous. The military remote breach revealed that the mind is not confined to one reality, that consciousness can act as a bridge. But when you build bridges, others can cross them too. And so we must ask, if our thoughts can reach across dimensions, how long until something reaches back? And when it does, will we recognize the difference between us and them? Stanford University, 2001. In a laboratory focused on quantum vacuum energy research, scientists pushed their instruments beyond known limits in pursuit of a cleaner, more efficient energy source. The goal was to create a region of near-perfect emptiness, a vacuum so pure it surpassed anything naturally occurring in the universe. What they created was not a vacuum. It was a hole in reality. Dr. Sarah Kim led the research team as they used electromagnetic fields to suppress quantum fluctuations, the jittering dance of virtual particles that normally ensures no space is truly empty. As the vacuum chamber stabilized, a chilling discovery emerged, regions where quantum activity ceased entirely. Not low, not suppressed, absent. The equipment wasn't just quiet, it was dead. They had opened a portal to a void dimension, a realm of absolute nothingness. Not darkness, not cold, not space, nothing. A place where no matter, energy, or even the laws of physics existed. And it was expanding. At first, the boundary between our world and the void was microscopic. But the void, by its very nature, consumed everything it touched. Like a silent erosion of reality itself, it spread, unnoticed at first, then alarmingly fast. Instruments disappeared, then tools, then part of the chamber itself. What was most disturbing wasn't the destruction. It was the absence. Objects didn't explode or decay. They simply ceased to be, as if they had never existed at all. No energy was released, no trace remained. Researchers tried to close the portal, but conventional methods failed. The void was feeding on the very energy used to contain it. The vacuum systems became its fuel. Matter injected to fill the breach vanished instantly, accelerating the spread. Then came the first human contact. A technician accidentally stepped too close. There was no scream, no motion, just silence. When his colleagues turned to look, he was gone, without a trace, not even a footprint left behind. It was as if the void had rewritten history to erase him entirely. Panic swept through the team. The facility went into lockdown. Using emergency protocols, they devised a brutal but effective containment strategy: continuous matter injection. By feeding the void a steady stream of sacrificial material, lead, carbon, synthetic composites, they stabilized its hunger, keeping it just barely at bay. To this day, the breach is still active. It resides in a secured underground vault, monitored around the clock by a classified division tasked with containment of existential threats. No personnel are allowed within 50 feet of the chamber. Automated systems feed the void. No one knows if it can ever be closed, or if it is part of some natural cycle of reality's end. The void is a reminder of what may await all universes: a terminal silence beyond entropy, where not even memory survives. To the scientific community, the experiment was quietly retired. Officially, funding ran out. Unofficially, it became the most heavily guarded secret in academic history. The academic void portal isn't just a curiosity. It is a prophecy. It whispers the question we hope never to answer. If everything, matter, energy, thought, can vanish without trace, what, if anything, can truly be said to exist? And if the void is what remains when all else is gone, was it here before us, or is it already waiting to return? Cleveland, 2015. In a conference room layered with glass walls and magnetic whiteboards, engineers at a prominent aerospace defense contractor unveiled a new theoretical model for time-independent communication, a method of sending information that bypassed conventional physics. But buried deep within their technical framework was a secret. They weren't just theorizing. They had already succeeded. The system, internally codenamed Project Halcyon, was based on quantum entanglement principles. The team believed that by exploiting non-locality, it might be possible to transfer data between particles instantaneously, not merely across space, but across dimensions. It was funded through a private sector collaboration with a defense agency seeking non-terrestrial communication protocols. Initial tests yielded minor anomalies. Then something shifted. When entangled particle pairs were subjected to synchronized magnetic pulses, researchers noticed signal behavior that didn't correspond to either control variable. It was as if a third source, unaccounted for, was introducing data into the system. The code wasn't random. It had structure, rhythm, patterns consistent with language. The breakthrough came during a midnight session when the team, fatigued but curious, allowed the system to run untethered. What appeared on the monitor was a block of information, not in binary but in modular prime sequences. When translated, it resolved into schematics. But the blueprints weren't for anything anyone had designed. They depicted a machine, one capable of manipulating local space-time using a recursive geometric matrix, technology far beyond contemporary understanding. What stunned the team wasn't just the design, it was the signature in the data header. It belonged to one of the researchers, a future version of himself. What followed was a frenzy of secret development. The machine was constructed piece by piece over weeks in a remote facility. When activated, it didn't produce energy. It didn't emit noise. It opened something, a shimmering rift the size of a coin, hovering in midair. Through it, they saw a version of their own lab, aged and worn, flickering with unfamiliar light. Movement came into view. A technician, older, glancing toward the rift with wide, exhausted eyes. He raised his hand. So did one of the engineers on this side. They moved in perfect synchrony. The rift closed seconds later. From that moment, everything changed. The team began receiving bursts of data, sometimes as raw code, other times as emotional impressions. Concepts, warnings, abstract instructions. They weren't alone in time. Their own future was reaching back. But the messages grew darker. Fragmented sequences hinted at catastrophe, collapse imminent, loop breach, too late to sever. A pattern emerged. Each breakthrough was being fed backward to accelerate progress. But with every leap forward, the system became more unstable. The feedback loop tightened. Paradoxes formed. Then came the final message. Do not trust continuity. That night, one of the lead engineers disappeared. Security footage showed him simply vanishing, mid-step, mid-sentence, as if removed from the timeline. No trace, no evidence he had ever worked there, except for fading memories among his colleagues. Project Halcyon was terminated. The lab was dismantled. The remaining researchers were scattered, placed under lifelong non-disclosure agreements, and given new assignments. Their memories, partially altered using neuromodulation protocols, remained fragile, fractured. But in their dreams, many still see the rift. This final unofficial experiment proved something deeply unsettling. Time is not fixed. Identity is not linear. And information may be the thread that stitches realities together or tears them apart. So we ask, if knowledge can echo backward, altering its own origin, who is writing the future? And more hauntingly, have we already read it? Hidden beneath layers of classified encryption and forgotten infrastructure, there lies a quiet story, the kind passed between old scientists with long memories and deeper silences. It's a story about an experiment that was never supposed to exist. A theoretical exploration of dimensional bleed, a rare event where the fabric of one reality momentarily overlaps with another. In 2006, under the codename Project Silhouette, a small joint task force of physicists and military analysts set out to model these transient moments of overlap using data anomalies collected over decades. Unexplained particle bursts, photographic distortions, and identical people seen in multiple locations simultaneously. What they discovered was that dimensional bleed didn't happen at random. It followed a pattern, one influenced not by mass or energy, but by consciousness. They found that in moments of deep emotional resonance, grief, awe, extreme decision-making, some individuals became anchors for overlapping realities. Their consciousness, for a few seconds, acted as a bridge, not just observing other worlds, but temporarily living in them. The team called them convergence events. They studied war veterans who remembered battles that never occurred, artists who painted scenes from unknown cities, and children who spoke languages they'd never been taught. In each case, their brain scans revealed harmonic fluctuations in regions associated with memory and identity, fluctuations that matched readings from CERN, NASA, and military installations during dimensional experiments. The convergence wasn't technological. It was personal. One subject, a retired schoolteacher from Nebraska, described living two lives simultaneously, one here and one in a world where the United States no longer existed. Her accounts were vivid, detailed, consistent. When asked to sketch her alternate home, she drew structures that matched architecture from a declassified parallel timeline accessed during the Montauk project. She wasn't delusional. She was remembering. More subjects came forward, unconnected, unprompted. A firefighter who recalled a life as a pilot in a timeline where humanity had colonized the moon. A physicist who claimed to have died in 1985 and could describe in detail his own funeral, attended by people who were still alive. All of them experienced the same strange pull, the same quiet certainty. They had lived elsewhere, and part of them never came back. Project Silhouette eventually uncovered a deeper truth. It wasn't just people crossing dimensions. It was reality itself, fracturing. The more humanity probed the boundaries through portals, mirrors, quantum links, the more the membranes between worlds thinned. Dimensional identities began to blur, not all at once, not in cataclysm, but subtly, elegantly, like threads unraveling in a tapestry too large to see. Some anomalies became permanent. Time loops that never resolved, places where the laws of physics changed from hour to hour, people who remembered different histories than those around them, and had proof. Project Silhouette was quietly dismantled, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. Too much. The data was buried. The researchers reassigned or retired under heavy psychiatric surveillance. The story, like so many, faded into whispers. But for those who understand, one fact remains. Dimensional bleed isn't fiction. It's memory. It's the part of you that wakes up remembering a life you never lived, a choice you never made, a city you've never seen but somehow recognize. And if realities are bleeding into one another, slowly merging into something new, we must ask, are we becoming something greater, or are we simply losing ourselves? And will we know the difference when it happens? Across continents and decades, from underground labs to sealed data vaults, one pattern emerges. The more we seek to understand reality's edges, the more those edges move. Each forbidden experiment, whether cloaked in military secrecy or buried beneath academic abstraction, has revealed the same unsettling truth. Reality is not a monolith. It is a mosaic, and we are only beginning to glimpse the pieces. From the geometric beings that step through CERN's breached collider, to the mirrored humans aging backward in time, to the void that consumes not just matter, but memory. These stories are not isolated events. They are symptoms of something larger, the collapse of a singular worldview into a multiversal awareness. It's not that the universe is changing, it's that we are. Each experiment tore a small hole in the veil, enough to show that behind the equations and instrumentation lies something deeper. A truth too vast for a single paradigm to contain. A truth that whispers, consciousness is not confined, time is not linear, and reality is not one. The scientists involved were not villains or saviors. They were explorers, human beings caught between wonder and responsibility, asking questions their instruments couldn't quite answer. Many paid the price in silence, erased identities, or truths too dangerous to share. Not because they meddled where they shouldn't, but because they saw what cannot be unseen. And yet, the doors remain open. Even when closed physically, the knowledge remains. The theories have spread, quietly shaping the next generation of thinkers, artists, and dreamers. We see it in quantum literature, in speculative art, in the way children speak of alternate selves with eerie fluency. The fringe has become the seedbed of tomorrow's science. These dimensional echoes now reside not just in research labs, but in us. In our minds, our dreams, our persistent sense that something is off, that something deeper is waiting just beyond perception. So where does that leave us? Perhaps with humility, with the understanding that truth is not a destination, but a direction. That knowledge, like reality, is layered, and layered things must be handled with care. Perhaps, too, with responsibility, because the question is no longer, can we open the door? We already have. The question is, can we live with what comes through? And finally, with wonder. Because buried beneath the warnings and containment protocols is a more ancient instinct, the same one that first looked up at the stars and asked, what else is there? We are still asking, and maybe that's the point. Not to control the multiverse, not to conquer it, but to listen, to learn, to step carefully toward a future shaped not by fear, but by understanding. Because in the end, what these experiments have shown us isn't just the fragility of our world, it's the possibility of many. The maps have no edges now. The mirrors reflect more than just our faces. And reality, it seems, is still becoming. So we close this story with a question, not an answer. If everything you know could change in a single thought, a single step, a single glance through the veil, would you cross the threshold? Or would you turn back, knowing the threshold is already behind you?